So we left off last time starting to talk about contemporary architects, and going to continue that. We talked about Renzo Piano and Norman Foster and I.M. Pei. We left off with I.M. Pei, and we'll carry on. Some of the architects we're talking about, like Pei, who died just a few years ago, or this gentleman here, Harry Weese, who died in 1998. Some of them have passed on, sometimes relatively young, but these are people that are really important. They sort of came out of the modernist movement largely, as I think I mentioned, and adapted that to a more contemporary, aesthetic, usually starting in the 1980s, but certainly as we got into the 90s and into the 2000s. Harry Weese here was a little older maybe than that group, born in 1915, died in 1998. He's actually from Evanston, so he's a local guy. Studied at MIT, worked and studied under Alvar Aalto, who we had talked about previously, the Finnish architect. His fellow students were, Eero Saarinen, I.M. Pei. So, he went to Cranbrook and studied with the Saarinens there. So, really strong pedigree and background for Weiss. He came back to Chicago and worked for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And as we talked about when we were talking about in that lecture, pretty established Miesian international style post-war architecture firm. But in 1947, he started his own practice, and again, really was working in the modernist genre. Sort of shifted towards expressionist forms, which he would have learned from Saarinen, and was, enamored with Corbusier and all that. So he was also an advocate for historic preservation. We talked in one of our last lectures about by the 1960s, there was this sort of counter movement to all this urban renewal and massive suburban growth, and the changes in architecture and culture and planning that came out of that. The reaction was this historic preservation movement. And ironically, a lot of these early modernist architectures, people who had really embraced modernism and the concept of, creating a completely different kind of architecture, not rooted in the past, were some of the early advocates for saving architecture rooted in the past. Whether it was Queen Anne houses or H.H. Richardson's Romanesque revival architecture or something like that. And so Weiss was one of those in Chicago and was really an early proponent of that. All right, so a couple of projects I want to show you. This one is another one in Columbus, Indiana. We talked about Elio Saarinen's First Christian Church there, and I briefly showed you Eero Saarinen's church, which I really like. This is First Baptist Church in Columbus from 1965, and this is already, it's modernist, right? There's no real ornament here, but he really breaks this into very strong geometries. It's almost like he's playing with building blocks. Frank Lloyd Wright, I don't know if you know the story of Froebel blocks with Frank Lloyd Wright. His mother, when he was a little child, his mother gave him a set of building blocks that were somewhat educational. They were meant to be more educational, and they were blocks. They were different geometric shapes and forms, and he put these together, and that's, he would talk later about this kind of like how he learned about architecture, and sort of one reason why his architecture could be so geometric in style and form. And you can sort of see the same thing here with Harry Weiss. Very, very strong geometries, and interesting way of creating a church steeple or spire with this really strong triangular masonry wall with just a little hole cut in it for what is either a cross or a bell or something like that. And there's actually two wings. There's a main chapel or main sanctuary, and I think a side chapel, and then you can't hardly see it, but there's some classrooms and so forth down the other side there, and like a little garden and fellowship area. It's almost like what Wright was doing in a way in some of his early work, and but he's just breaking it down to those pure geometric forms. A couple of, you know, because he largely worked in Chicago, there's some important works here in the city, and perhaps one of his most famous, even though many people don't know it's Harry Weese, perhaps, but it's just such a prominent site, is the 17th Church of Christ Scientist from 1968. And this is right on Wacker Drive at Water Street, where the river bends. So if you're going eastbound on Wacker, you kind of veer to the left to get towards Michigan Avenue. And right on this triangular site is this prominent church that really adapts to its site. You know, this is a great example of kind of what we talked about with expressionism, but regionalism. Now, regionalism being this region is this site. You know, it's a really prominent site, and it's, you know, a really strong geometric form. And he puts a church on here that looks like it belongs here. You know, it just sits right here. But it's also very modern. It's not Gothic. It's not, you know, neoclassical or something like that. So it's a pure modernist structure, but it's really forming to its very specific site. He uses a lot of concrete here. Weiss definitely, again, like I said, he was sort of influenced by Corbusier and Eero Saarinen, who was using a lot of concrete in his work as well. So we see here a lot of formed and precast concrete. So here's a better view. This is, I think I took this, I might have taken this photo from the balcony of Marina City. And it's just a really prominent, it's not even quite a triangle in sight, but he uses this curve along the corner here to help really anchor that site there on the corner. And then and you don't always see it, but you see this from the ground, but from above you see this strong skylight element with a kind of a cap on it that provides essentially light and stuff over the vaulted space, over the sanctuary space on the inside. And that's revealed on the interior with a very expressionist kind of interior space. I don't know, I actually didn't get inside this until maybe just a few years ago. You know, I knew the outside of the building so well, but when I finally got inside, I was like, wow, this is really cool. And they've kept it. This is, you know, what, 1968. They've kept the interior design and the color schemes and all of that really intact. I mean, it's stepping into a scene from 1968, and they actually used this auditorium in that movie series. Is it Divergent or something like that? I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's like this apocalyptic. Sorry, I can't talk too well. Post-apocalypse or whatever, you know, thing is set in Chicago, and this is like the big auditorium where they, I don't know, sort people or something like that. I only saw the movie once. I'm like, hey, that's the church. Here's another view of that, and you can see that the exterior element, you know, of the sort of arcing, vaulting, and that sort of little bottle cap on top is revealed on the inside. So he's being expressionist here, and he's showing that the form and the function are united. You know, if we're going all the way back to Louis Sullivan, right? You know, that those words by Sullivan, even though Sullivan was doing something completely different stylistically, you know, his words have really continued on even, you know, well into the late 20th century. And I think, you know, show you examples of the 21st century where it still applies. He's really famous in many ways for the Washington, D.C. metro system. This started in the mid-1970s. Washington, you know, decided they needed you know, rail transit system starting from scratch, you know, whereas, you know, New York and Boston, Chicago all had, you know, 19th century train line systems. Washington was starting from scratch, and so it's you know, at least in the main part of the city, it's all a subway underground. And he essentially, his firm oversaw this, the design, and oversaw the construction, at least in the early stages. And he uses what's known as a waffle slab concrete construction here. They call it waffle slab because it looks like a waffle, right? But it's a really effective, functional, or efficient concrete form system. It's this all poured concrete. And these ribs, the ribs of the waffles, provide a lot of strength to the system. And so it makes for a great vaulted space here. That it also kind of is aesthetic, right? But he's not adding ornament to this. He's not, applying anything to make it look pretty. He's just using the forms or shapes of the waffling to create kind of a really elegant visual when you're down in the system. It needs a lot of renovation, especially the train car systems and stuff, but it's still a really beautiful, clean subway system. You go into Washington subway, and it is far different than going into the subway down in the loop for the L, or if you're in New York's subway or something like that, which are you feel like you got to take a shower afterwards. And Metro, the Washington Metro is still pretty awesome. Here's a few more images, and you can cross these. This is almost going back to Roman construction and architecture. These are basically almost barrel vaults, and here we have a groin vault. We bringing up what we talked about last semester. That all that still applies, right? So it's a little different kind of form. The Romans didn't create waffle slab construction concrete, but we have a basic groin vault right here. There's another project that he's pretty well, at least people know the building in Chicago. If they don't know, it's by Harry Weese. This is the Federal Detention Center in the Loop from 1975. This is in the southern part of the Loop. I was going to say South Loop, but that's kind of its own neighborhood. And it's distinctive because it's this triangular shape, and then it's got concrete exteriors because it's a prison. It's not really a prison. It's really a detention center for the federal courthouse. So if you commit a federal crime, they hold you here while you're going to trial or waiting for trial or something like that. So if you get convicted, then you go to some federal penitentiary somewhere in Terre Haute or whatever. But it's essentially a jail, and so you can't have a lot of windows. But he did put in these slit windows that are really narrow, that allow light into the cells, into the interior. And he thought that was important. That okay, yeah, they committed crimes, and they're going to have to serve their punishment if they're convicted, but they should still at least have some humanity, get a little bit of light in, and the windows are narrow enough where they're like, okay, nobody can escape. Plus, you're on a skyscraper, you can't, even if you got through the window, what are you going to do? You're 20 stories high. And on the very top is an outdoor court area here, basketball courts, or they can go out, get some fresh air, that sort of thing. Here is the plan, and in a way this is a functional plan as well, because it has the cells are on the three sides of the triangle, and in the center is some open atrium area, and the guards can easily see pretty much all the cells from the central location. And so it's a pretty functional plan, although you do get into the little funky triangle shapes at the end here that I was talking about last time. I think there was still this obsession with geometry when I was in architecture school that I sometimes dabbled in, and you'd get these little leftover spaces where it's like, oh, I'll put the stair in here, and I'll show you another example where that doesn't work too well. So here's a nice view of that. That's the Board of Trade building off there in the background. And you can see the slit windows for the cells that are pretty narrow, and so the idea was that nobody could fit through those anyway, and then you're 20 stories high. Except, I think in the next slide, yeah, except a few years ago, I forget, somebody did it. They got through the window. I guess they were really skinny, and they got a bunch of bed sheets, and they went down, I think it was like 15 floors, that they had enough bed sheets put together that they shimmied down like Batman and Robin and got down to the ground with these bed sheets, and two guys escaped. And I don't know, they were out there on the run for like a week or two, and I mean, they had committed crimes. They were not great people, but there was sort of a populace like, all right, go for it, they did it, just because they had some gall to do that, and to with no harness, no safety measures, and they literally crawled down the entire 10 or 15 floors of the building to escape in the middle of the night. So the other project, just a little local one, is here in Oak Park. He designed the Village Hall in 1975, and here he's in his full obsession with geometries. You can see the prow of the building here is this, triangle that's left over. And this is a funky building. I don't know if you've ever been inside Oak Park Village Hall, but it's a weird building. It got listed on the National Register of Historic Places a few years ago. I mean, it's certainly a significant building, but it's a little weird. Here's an aerial view, actually a historic aerial view of it. He put a nice courtyard in the center that never gets used, really. The idea was that here's Madison Street, so this is sort of the front, and people could sort of walk from Madison into the courtyard and into the building. Well, everybody comes in off the parking lot in the back, and there's sort of a back door, and this courtyard doesn't get used, and they lock the doors now and everything. So even if you wanted to go in the courtyard, you can't really. This little weird triangular shape over on the bottom left is the actual council chambers, and it's literally a triangle shape inside. It's a very weird space. I've gone to a lot of board meetings. I've sat on a lot of commissions that would meet in here, and it's a really weird space to work in. But here's the floor plan. So here's the courtyard in the middle, and then this is really the back door over here on the far left. That is now the main entrance, so it's a little weird that way. And then the council chamber is down here in the bottom right, and you can see in a way it almost works. The members sit here in the little horseshoe down at the bottom, and then you get almost a sort of amphitheater-like effect, but you got these triangles at the ends that are just weird leftover spaces. Sometimes people will kind of go on into one of the triangles during a meeting, and they'll whisper, about something happening in the meeting or whatever, and they're kind of off in a quiet corner, I guess. But the other weird thing is you actually, it's hard to see here. You go up a set of stairs to get into the council chambers, and the stairs are on an angle. It's a weird stair set to climb, and then you go through a tunnel, like a little bridge tunnel, to get into the council chambers. It's a funky little design. Here's the outside. This is the outside of the council chambers, and then there's a ramp system that is great. It's for accessibility, except that this doesn't get used either. Now there's a chairlift on the inside to get you up to that level, but at least he was thinking about it in the 1970s. So here's the interior of the sort of main working area. Some of the staff say they're not real fond of working in here. It's very loud because it's all open. It's a cool space visually, but it's not always the most best work environment. All right, so another architect to talk about is Richard Meier. He has had some significant personal controversies of lately. He basically was found out that he was harassing a lot of his female staff, which is pretty much discredited him. But he has done a lot of good work that needs to be talked about, at least from a professional standpoint. He attended Cornell. He was from New York, and again, really worked in the modernist genre. But he really became known for working in white. Like all of his buildings, were almost pure white, and we'll see that in a couple of these examples. One of his earliest projects that kind of helped put him on the map was the Athenaeum in a little town called New Harmony, Indiana, which is down in way southwest Indiana. It's in the middle of nowhere. I've been there a couple times, but it's in the middle of nowhere. And but it was this religious utopian community back in the mid 19th century, in the 1800s, and so it's this slightly tourist town, and this Athenaeum here was a little part of that, that people were coming to visit this town, and this was built for it. And as you can see here, he's sort of obsessed with some of these strong geometric forms as well, but everything is white. The The cladding of the building is completely white. You know, the handrails of the stairs are white. You know, the mullions of the windows are white. Everything is just purely white here. It's almost, you know, it's a little bit like Corbusier. He's probably influenced by Corbusier's work, who worked a lot in white or in white concrete, although a lot of times he added color. Meier would never really add colors to his buildings here. Here is the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, 1983, and you can see that this is just carrying on the theme of the Athenaeum. You know, white panels on the outside, you know, white handrails, white concrete, you know, white window trim, everything, you know, is white, but also the strong geometric forms as well. And perhaps his greatest work is the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, started in 1997. It was built over a number of years. It's a massive complex. It sits up on one of the hills in the foothills overlooking the LA Valley Basin. It's really dramatic. In fact, to get to it, you park down in the valley and you take this sort of tram system up to the top of the hill here, and then it's a pedestrian zone. You walk around this campus without cars and all that, and it's really an incredible place to visit. Not art, but for the sense of place, the vistas. There's, you know, outdoor cafes and gardens and so forth that, you know, people will come and they'll just hang out on the lawn here and sun themselves in the, you know, sunny LA weather, or at least, you know, when the smog isn't in the way. It's really an amazing complex, to be sure. And as you can see, you know, we'll go back to the, it's all white. I mean, he does use, as we'll see, he does use some local stone, which isn't, you know, pure bright white like we were seeing in the last examples, but when he's not using that, he's, you know, using bright white cladding and painted elements. But also I want to point out here, as you see all the different geometries, you know, that he's using, those same, carrying on the same theme he was using in his earlier works there. I thought this was cool. This is in the middle of the complex, and it's just a model that's designed for the visually impaired of the complex. And you can see there's some braille markings on the top, so you can know what building what is. But, you know, you can, if you're visually impaired, you can actually, you know, sort of experience this complex and the design of it. So on the left there, that's Melissa's hand, my wife's hand, touching that or whatever. I wanted to get a photo of that. So here's just some views. This is actually the view as you get off that tram. There's this sort of grand stair and sort of platform. There, you know, there's some sculptural art on display, and you can just hang out here. You know, if you're waiting for your tram later to take back down, you might be waiting 10 or 15 minutes. So you just sit on the steps here, and you can hang out, and you can see the, in this case, the building here in the foreground, which is sort of the main building that you enter. You know, all the ticketing is in here, and, you know, restrooms and bookshops and things like that are in here. It's clad in white panels, just like we saw with the other structures. But then some of the other buildings, like in this example, have a different kind of stone. It's still a really light colored stone, but it isn't, you know, bright white like the buildings. But it does help to provide a little more, I don't know, softness to, it's hard to say that with stone maybe, but it anchors the building more to nature, in my opinion. I actually felt like, you know, his other buildings are kind of cold, you know, they're just nothing but bright white geometries. I thought the stone here really helped to create a more natural feel, anchoring it more to nature, and a nice complement to some of the trees and landscaping that exist in the fountains here. It's really cool. It was a beautiful day when we were visiting these photos, and, you know, it was just filled with people. Of course, it's all pre-pandemic, filled with people and, you know, families. You know, some people just hanging out outside, having cafes, coffees, food. People, as I say, were sunning themselves on some of the lawns. There are a number of fountains. This is one of them in the main courtyard, using, again, some of the natural stone from the site to incorporate into that. So in a way, this is a little bit more regionalist than most of his work. Most of his work, you could just plop that anywhere. That Athenaeum in New Harmony, that has nothing to do with Southwest Indiana. But this feels more like it's anchored to LA, but still in his, design genre. Here's a view of one of the courts and some of the landscape off in the distance. I forget who the landscape designer is. I believe pretty famous landscape designer as well. I think I have another. Yeah, here's a shot of some of the landscaping. When you're in the climate of LA, you can have some really cool outdoor plants and let people hang out. Here's another view. Here's the view. You got some great views of the LA Valley. You can see downtown LA and Hollywood and all that kind of stuff from the views up here. Okay, moving on to somebody I think who's a little nicer guy. Tadao Ando was born in 1941 and from Japan, and really is one of the most famous post-World War II Japanese architects. He grew up, he was familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright because Wright had done a major project in Tokyo in the 1920s, the Imperial Hotel. We didn't really talk about that. There's way too many projects by Frank Lloyd Wright to talk about. So that was influential to him, and he has talked about the fact that seeing that as a child and growing up with that has made him interested in architecture. He more formally studied Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, and as consequently really adopted concrete, as his material of choice, and is really considered to be one of the greatest practitioners in concrete, and his detail and his attention to detail is exquisite. Like Louis Kahn, when we talked about Louis Kahn and the Salk Institute and the way he would make the contractor put together the forms and the connectors for the forms, so that when the forms are removed, the concrete shape that you see or the surfaces that you see become almost decorative without adding any ornamentation to that. And so here's a few examples. Okay, here's the Imperial Hotel. I wanted to at least show you that. A couple on the upper left and on the right are some historic views of the hotel built in the 1920s. Sadly, it survived World War II, amazingly, given the Allied bombing of Japan and of Tokyo. But sadly, in the 1960s, the development pressure of the growing city just, spelled the death knell of this, and so it was demolished. On the bottom left is a fragment of the entry lobby that was disassembled and then rebuilt in a park outside of Tokyo. It's kind of like a little Japanese building zoo. These are those little places like the Napier settlement in Naperville. If you've ever been there, I call them building zoos. You just gather buildings and you collect them on a site. So this is here, and this is all that's left. You can see in the other images there was a lot more to it, of course. So it's just a little fragment of the lobby, but at least that's there. It's on my list to go see sometime when I visit Japan. So here is one of his residential designs from 1986, the Kidosaki House in Osaka. And here, I think you can really see the connection with Louis Kahn, and especially his Salk Institute. You can see the lines between the forms that create almost a faint grid in the concrete, and then the little dots are where the forms were held together with pins or whatever, and when those all removed, the little dots remain in the concrete. And how you do that, and the spacing and the, it all creates a visual image when you're done. And you can see here it's minimalist. Ando is really known for his minimalism. There is nothing here that doesn't need to be here. If you go back to the Misesian philosophy of almost nothing, this fully embraces that. But pure concrete planes and forms. I like this opening here that lets light in, and the light becomes decorative. You don't need ornamentation if the building itself and then if the shadows and the lighting on it create visual interest. And Ando is really a master at doing that. And he also has this connection with nature. I mean, in Japan, which is, massively built, extremely dense in the cities, there's not a lot of opportunities for vistas and, looking at gardens and you don't have suburban yards like we do in the US. But you create a courtyard and you have water, you have some greenery in planters, and that is the way that you can connect to nature. And that's in Japanese culture. I mean, they have a strong connection with nature in their culture, and this is the way that, at least in Ando's view, that you can still have that connection. One of my favorite projects of his is this Church of Light, and this is a model of it. He kind of created this model and design for it for years before it actually got built. He didn't actually have a client for it, as my understanding, and he just came up with this, and he wanted to do it, and he finally later would find a client. This is from 1989, and the model here was on display recently at the Rightwood Gallery, and on a larger collection of some of Ando's work that Melissa and I went and saw. And I was so thrilled to see this model because I was familiar with this project and I've seen the photos of the model before, and it's like, yes, there it is. But what I like about this is that it is just pure form. It's a masterful use of concrete. He creates a sanctuary space that you can see on the left, and the cruciform just sort of carved out of the concrete to create that light effect. He's not adding a cruciform over a wall. The wall becomes the cross. And what I also love about it is the way this angled wall comes out and creates an entry path. And we have sort of a Wrightian passage of discovery here, in that you enter really from what would be the front part of the church, or actually the back part of the church, right, where the altar is. That's where you enter, except then you are led down along the side, and so you would enter into the church itself in the back where you normally would, but it's a pathway leading you there, and then you can move up into the pews, and of course you have the altar in the front. So it's a really, really interesting use of space with just a few lines, right? There's so little here, but yet there is so much, and there's such a great complexity of space and of light. Here's more photos I took. This model really is out of concrete. These are actual concrete walls in this model, which is really cool. So here you can see I got down, and I'm taking zoom photos of the entry sequence. You walk down into this court area here. There's this large window in the back that lets in light into the space a little bit. It's just really fabulous. And so, versions of this were kind of built. This is the Church of Light in Osaka from 1989. So it did get built, at least in some form here, and you can kind of see that still. Here's the form in the wall. Here's that sort of wing wall that comes out to sort of draw people in. There's another wing on the other side here that provides probably space that you need in a church, like offices and classrooms and things like that. But it's still pretty reflective of his original design concept. And here's an interior of that actual church, so you get a pretty good sense of how it got implemented. And again, look at the way the light is on that cruciform, and light is one of the most fundamental aspects of architecture. I think I've talked about this before this semester and even last semester. And some of the greatest architects know how to use and manipulate light, and how to use light to create a sense of space and to create emotions and feelings. Ando is definitely a master of doing that. Here is another project, the Museum of Wood Culture in Hyogo, Japan from 1994. This is very much a regionalist kind of approach. This is about a museum devoted to wood, and so it uses a lot of wood. He still has a lot of concrete, that's what he's but he's integrating wood into the design as well. And he really anchors it into this very rural naturalist site, forested site here. And here's some images of it, just using the raw wood. He doesn't paint it, doesn't treat it any other way. He just lets it gray in weather. When it weathers, it turns to gray, the way wood would. That's, to him, that is the way that the most honest way of using wood in architecture. On the interior here, we see this cool, in the middle of the circle is this cool fountain area with a little concrete bridge that you can walk across. I've never been here, and I don't fully understand exactly all the things he was doing here, but I thought it was a cool project to show you. He's done 2 projects here in Chicago. And if you have not seen one of them, the second one I'll show you, put that on your list. It's fully accessible. It's actually open again. You just need to make an appointment in order to go visit. But the first one is the Eichener Lee House from 1998. And this is a private home, and it's next door, right to the left is the other project, which is the Rightwood Gallery, but which was sponsored by this family here, a very wealthy family that they're philanthropists, and they hired this, even in 1998, he was well known, but he wasn't, quite as internationally known or famous as as other architects, but they brought Ando in to design their house, and you can see here he's doing much the same thing that he was doing in those other earlier examples, or like the Church of Light, in that he's using just concrete planes, beautifully detailed and designed to create a very minimalistic set of walls and experiences. This is an axonometric view of the house with the entry being, I believe, on the down here, and you can see that he creates a courtyard. It's more of a long narrow site, like your typical Chicago lot, and so he creates this inner courtyard that's very private, with a sort of building wing that connects the 2 wings on either end, so that, and a lot of glass to connect, the interior with the natural courtyard on the outside. And here's a view of that, and much of that courtyard is actually a water pond or a reflecting pool or whatever. This reminds me a little bit of the reflecting pool at the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe from 1929 that we had talked about, and it's filled with the sort of gray river rock, that you often see in Japanese gardens. So it's a little bit of a kind of a hybrid Japanese garden here, but also using water as well. But you can also see the elements of the 2 wings, and then the connecting wing and the ramps that all connect the different parts of this house and provide a view and a vista from inside the house of this beautiful exterior. Here's another view. This house is not normally open. I found these online, but it's not normally open to the public or whatever, so it's pretty cool to get a chance to at least see some of these views. So right next door, literally, is the Rightwood 659 Gallery. So what the family did is they bought this apartment building that dates from the 1920s, and as you can see on the left, it's kind of a typical neoclassical, slightly colonial revival, apartment facade. And rather than just tear the whole thing down, they kept the shell and they kept the facade, and they hired Ando to remake the interior. They gutted it completely and create a new art gallery space that would exhibit any number of artistic exhibitions. And so here, it was finished in 2018, so it hasn't been open very long, but like I say, it is open again now. And on the right is sort of the main lobby atrium space. And the brick wall with the windows is the backside of this facade here with the windows. It's a really amazing space to go in, because you look at the outside and you think, what's the big deal? You go inside and it's something completely different. And you really see the mastery of his detailing here. It's incredible. And a lot of the people that were in the museum were really there to see the Ando architecture. There were a couple of cool exhibitions going on, and I enjoyed that, but it was the highlight was seeing the architecture for sure. And I think a lot of other people kind of felt the same way that we're here. Here's a view of, there's a sort of central core. Oh, cool. Yeah, yeah, got to see it as well. Yeah, like I say, it's a free. I think it's still free to visit. You just have to make a pre-appointment or whatever. It's just incredible space. And so here's the central core, has an elevator inside of it, and then on the outside is this open staircase with a glass railing, all in concrete. And it concrete like this, it looks like it's just simple, like, oh, what's the big deal? Concrete, to create concrete as pure and detailed as this is not easy to do. It really isn't. It kind of wants to do its own thing, and you pull those forms off and you don't know what you're going to get. And so a lot of times I would imagine he has to redo it, and the type of concrete, the mix and the spec and everything that you use has to be just right. It looks very simple, but it is not, especially to get it so perfect. And I love this. This is up on the roof deck. There's a sort of a balcony walkway along here with a concrete wall on one side. And if you go in the afternoon and there's some sun like this, it creates this incredible shadow effect. And people were just lined up along the balcony here, and all their reflections were on there, this sort of silhouette shadow reflection. And you see, the silhouettes of trees on the adjacent site and of the mullions of the windows. I mean, this is art. And I think people were really experiencing that, like, wow, this is a gallery wall of art, but it's mobile, it's kinetic. And my wife and I sort of took a selfie of our reflect or of our silhouette or whatever, and I still have that as my Facebook profile photo. All right, so here's a name that I think everybody will be familiar with. A lot of non-architects know this guy's name as well, Frank Gehry. Born in 1929, actually from Canada, moved to the U.S., studied at UCLA and at Harvard, but went back to LA, no big surprise, and actually worked for Victor Gruen. Remember him? He was the modernist architect that became famous for building shopping malls in the mid 20th century. So kind of a weird origin for him to think of somebody like Frank Gehry actually design shopping malls for a while. So again, he came out of the modernist tradition, but unlike some of the earlier architects we've seen, Gehry breaks into something completely different, something what we really consider called deconstruction that arises in the 1980s. And it's the deconstruction movement is really the idea of sort of breaking apart the concept of walls and structure and breaking it into its individual elements and forms, a little bit like what Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers did at the Pompidou Center, but even in a more radical way. The Pompidou is still a standard structural system. It still has main mechanical systems. They just exposed it all. Deconstruction is like, okay, not only are we going to expose some of this stuff, but we're just going to break it apart. I had fellow students in design school. This was a big, deconstruction was really big when I was in school in the late 80s. And there were sometimes, late at night in studio and, people are working on their designs. And there was this one student who just took a piece of paper, he crumpled it up, he stuck it on a piece of cardboard, and that was his model for his design presentation the next day. And the professor just went, oh my God, this is brilliant. Oh, I've never seen so, and the rest of us are like, did he not realize that he just took a piece of paper and crumpled it up and put it on his board and then he went home? We were so pissed. But that's kind of my association with deconstruction. And certainly this can only arise out of the late 20th and early 21st century computer revolution. The CAD technologies allow this type of architecture to occur. So here's his own house. Someday I'll have to do a lecture, like just a fun lecture for the school on architects' own houses. So here's his house in Santa Monica. I got a chance to go see this. I took about 5 photos, and then my camera went kaput. And I don't mean the battery died. I mean like the camera died. It like broke or something. I don't know. So my wife fortunately got a few more photos than I did, but that was like kind of a bummer. So anyway, he took a bungalow, essentially, actually sort of a Dutch colonial revival. You can see it has this gambrel roof, which is classic of Dutch colonial architecture, and he just started playing with it, starting in the mid 70s. And like any good creative architect, he used this as his laboratory. He just started slapping up chain link fencing and corrugated metal and little leftovers of this and that, and he just stuck it on and started creating these forms and shapes and elements. I don't know if the neighbors were too thrilled about it. This kind of goes against what most people think of suburban housing. But he kind of became really avant-garde and famous. And for a long time in the 80s and early 90s, Gehry was this avant-garde architect that, didn't get a lot of commissions, didn't get a lot of work necessarily, but the people who were into this genre, into deconstruction, were like, oh, this is so cool, but it was really intellectual, right? Peter Eisenmann is another one, he's mentioned here, who, come up with all kinds of designs and theories, but he would never build anything. And the few things that he would build just didn't work functionally or structurally or anything. And many of them have been ripped out. But Gehry sort of broke out of that with a couple of key things. Here's a couple more images. This is the side of his house. It sits on a corner lot, and so this is on the sort of side street. And he puts an addition on that's covered in corrugated siding and just sort of a mishmash of raw wood and glass and different shapes and forms. The chimney is just sheet metal, right? That's the flue. The chimney flue is sheet metal, but the chimney now is just sheet metal. Why do you need to cover it with anything? This may look relatively like almost mainstream now, and we see a lot of corrugated metal used in architecture and stuff now, but this was radical. This was stuff that you would put on a factory. To put it on a residential home in a suburban subdivision like this was really out there in the 1970s and 80s. Let's see. So then he kind of put himself on the map with just a sculptural thing. He's always been very sculptural, as an artistically sculptural, and of course his buildings are that way too. But this is just a fish at the Olympic Park in Barcelona from the 1992 Barcelona Olympic Games, Summer Games. And this is a long sort of boardwalk along the Mediterranean coastline. The Olympic Village was nearby, and in 1992 when the Olympics were going on, there were tons and tons of people here, and they all saw this cool fish, and they thought, wow, that's really cool. Who did that? So this kind of helped put him a little bit on the map, even though it wasn't architecture. Another project from the mid-90s, which a lot of architects know about, but didn't necessarily get a lot of headlines in the media, is sometimes called, it's known as the Dancing House or the Fred and Ginger House. This is in Prague in the Czech Republic, and it sits on a prominent site along the river, and it's a really contextual project. Even though it's really modern, he uses the right scale, a lot of the materials and features and elements, but in a very, very modern, really beyond postmodern way, to create something really unique. This is actually one of my most favorite projects or building designs, and it's called Fred and Ginger. You guys probably don't even, the Czechs had no idea who Fred and Ginger were, but this is named after Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, the famous 1930s movie stars that did a lot of dancing, show tunes and things like that. So most of you probably don't know who that is, but Fred Astaire would be dressed in his tuxedo, very formal. He would be standing up straight posture. And then Ginger Rogers has this flowing gown, and she's twirling around. And so the idea is that the corner here, the rotunda, is Fred. And he's, formal. He's got, the stucco cladding and the formal windows and stuff. And here's Ginger, and here she is, with the curves of a woman and the gown, swooping out. And, there's this little balcony is like his arm, cinched around her waist. It's not meant to be literal. I don't think that's what he had in mind when he designed it, but people saw this and they thought, oh, that's like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And of course, Ginger Rogers had the famous quote, maybe you've heard this, where, I did everything that Fred Astaire did, but I did it backwards and in heels, right? So, kind of promoting the idea that women can be as good, if not better than men, because look what they got to do. So here's a more close-up view of the corner here, and you can see a little bit more like the balcony is this arm cinched around her waist and all that. So there's a link here to Swing Time, which is one of their famous movies, and they dance around and all that. I'll skip over that for now, but here's another view. Looking up her skirt. Sorry about that. But you get the sense of the structure, the concrete forms of the structure exposed, and then you got just this cladding of glass on the outside. This is, this part of the building is the deconstructed element, right? You see this, structure, and it's not even like regular, vertical and horizontal post and beam structure. It's just it's like somebody pushed it and deformed it, and then it's like, hey, that's cool, let's make it a building. Here's a detail of that. There's a little balcony. Move along here. So what really put him on the map and made him world famous is this, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, from 1997. Bilbao is in northern Spain. It was an industrial city in the Basque region for many, many decades. They had a separatist movement that sometimes got violent. There were terrorist attacks and bombings and things like that. And so Bilbao was a place that nobody went to. It was not a tourist destination in any means. It was an industrial city. It was dangerous in many cases. But by the mid-90s, the sort of terrorism and the separatist movement had sort of gone away. And so people were starting to discover Bilbao a little bit more. And the Guggenheim said, hey, we'll build a museum here, and we'll hire a famous architect to do something. And this started a movement in museum design in which the architecture becomes a star of the show. Most museums had always been built where, you go inside into the galleries and you look at the art. And one exception of that was the original Guggenheim, right, by Frank Lloyd Wright in New York City, where, the form, the building itself became more famous than any of the art that might go inside of it. And Bilbao carries on that tradition and really launches it to where museums all over the country, large and small, in the most obscure little cities said, oh, we're going to hire a famous architect. They're going to create this, masterful work of architecture, and then people will want to come and see it. It's called the Bilbao effect. They actually called it a name, the Bilbao effect, because so many people came to Bilbao to see this building. They didn't care about the art inside mostly. They wanted to see this building, and it was so different, so wacky. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. And so Bilbao suddenly became a hot tourist destination, and it still is. I haven't been there yet, but a lot of people, like to come here now. And a lot of that was because of this museum. This is clad in stainless steel, and you can see there are no straight walls here. This is the crumpled piece of paper I was talking about, and all of this had to be done using CAD-generated, construction design and construction technologies, and even the materials are fabricated, with using computer technologies and fabrication. There's just no way you could build this. In a way, this reminds me a little bit of Antonio Gaudí, right? It's almost the 21st century of Gaudi's work from the early 20th century. Here's here's the sketch of Bilbao. So this is like, again, he's sitting in studio late at night and he just scribbles and says, ah, that's it, that's the design. And how you got from this to this, I don't know. Right? It's all in his head, and this was part of what makes Gehry a master, right? At this, the student who just crumpled up the piece of paper didn't know what he was doing in studio. Um, Gehry is so brilliant. He knows how to go to create that out of this, and how to get there in his mind. Much the way Frank Lloyd Wright worked. Wright was famous also for having a design in his mind and then just sitting at a drafting table and spending an hour or two, and he would draft it all up or draw it all up, and it would just come out. And the people who worked for him were amazed. Clients were known to call and say, hey, Mr. Wright, I'm going to be at your office in a couple of hours. I really want to see that design you've been working on for months. And Wright would be like, oh, I better actually do it. So he would sit down and he would design it, and by the time the client got to the office, he had something to show him. I mean, that's a sign of brilliance there. Here's a computer modeling, and this is in the 1990s. Computer technologies and CAD were still a little bit basic. By the late 90s, they were getting a lot better. I started doing CAD a little bit in the early 90s, and it was really, really basic stuff. Not, but to start creating stuff like this is what allows for this kind of architecture. So here's another one. This puts them on the map, right? Bilbao puts them on the map, and now everybody wants a Gehry, and they want it to be like Bilbao. So part of his challenge was, well, how do I do that and not, copy Bilbao? So in Seattle, Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft, right, says, hey, I love music and I love guitars, and I want to create a museum of music that he called the Experience Music Project from 2000. And so, and this, many people saw this and thought, that should have been the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not what IMP did in Cleveland, which I showed you at the end of last time. This is like out there. This is psychedelic, man. If you drop some acid and then you create some rock music, this is what you'd get. I'm not advocating that, but this, we all know that, early rockers, especially from the like 60s and 70s, that's what they were doing. So, it is really funky, and he's not just using the shiny stainless steel. He does some chemical coatings to create different color effects. He's got these little ribbons of things on it. A lot of this is ornamental. I mean, these elements here are just added on. So he's almost creating. These are supposed to be guitar strings, I believe, that are just cut and it's lying around on there, if I'm not mistaken. But he's sort of going beyond into this next phase of architecture, which is he's not fully applying ornamentation. Buildings are so sculptural that they don't need much ornament, but there are occasions when he does add some elements that you kind of have to say, that's just ornament. So here's just a few views. Oh, this one, let me go back. This one here is kind of cool because the famous monorail that leads from downtown Seattle out to the Seattle, what's the tower thing? I'm forgetting the name of it. It passes through the building, so that's kind of a cool thing to see that. So, and then he keeps going. Disney, wants to do a concert hall in downtown LA, so they hire Frank Gehry to do that, and he creates really another Bilbao. This is really in the genre of Bilbao for sure, with the curved and folded plates, the stainless steel. This was a little bit infamous for a while because some of these shiny surfaces in these conical shapes did reflections of the sun that were shooting laser beams into neighboring buildings and melting things or whatever. So they had to do a few things to the building to settle some lawsuits and prevent the building from scorching, and shooting these sunbeams into the neighbors. So here's a few views. This is at the entrance here. It's pretty cool stuff. I like some of this work of Gehry's. when he's using these metal panels in this way. This is the interior of the concert hall. And in a way, this is sort of reflective of the exterior. A lot of times you go in these buildings that are all different forms and shapes like that, and they're just square boxes inside. I was a little disappointed in the Experience Music project because it's kind of that way. You walk inside and it's like, oh, it's nothing like the outside. At least this concert hall feels a little bit like the outside of the building. And we have our own example of Gehry right here in Chicago. This is the Pritzker Pavilion at Millennium Park. And I think this is I love this because it's just a band shell. It's just a shell to protect the stage. And to me, these folded sculptural shapes, it's like the perfect combination, because that's so much of what his work can be. It's this really artistic sculpture. And that, to me, is the perfect way to create a band shell. And I love these art elements that go out over the lawn that provide lighting and speakers and stuff like that. If you have never gone here, if you go to Millennium Park, come sit on the lawn. They don't always let you sit out here, unfortunately, to protect the grass. But if they're doing a practice or something like that, that's a great way. You can hear some great music, sit on the lawn, and you just hear them practicing, and it is amazing. The acoustics are amazing. The sense of space is amazing because you feel like you're in this semi-enclosed space, but you've got the cityscape all around you. It's really a cool place to be. So like I say, sometime you go to Millennium Park, and if they're allowing you to go on the lawn, go out there to sit and experience that, even if they're not playing any music. And of course, he also designed the Serpentine Bridge that goes across Columbus Drive and leads to Maggie Daley Park. When this was first built, this was like the bridge to nowhere. There was nothing over here, really. Now there's the ice rink and all that, so there's a lot more reason to go over the bridge than there used to be, but it's a pretty cool design for sure. All right, so let's move on. Rem Koolhaas, another pretty famous deconstructivist architect, born 1944. He's Dutch, from the Netherlands, and really early on was into radical theories. He was another one of these deconstructionist architects who started out more in theory and ideas than in buildings, but he's really broken out. He's incredibly famous, does work all over the firm, or all over the world with his firm OMA. And I'll show you a couple of examples. One right here in Chicago, the IIT Student Center from 2003. I actually worked on this, not the building itself with Rem Koolhaas. I haven't met him, but it incorporates one of Wiese's buildings, so I was working on the preservation of that. But I wasn't too fond of this. The material selection and all that is not the best. It's held up better than I thought it would, but it is a little funky. What is pretty cool is this tube that the L runs through. And a lot of people look at it, they go, oh, that's an L station. Well, it's not. It's just a tube, and it's done for acoustics because the L runs right over top of the building. He did not want you to be in the building and hear the L train going over all the time. It's very disruptive. And so he wrapped the top of the building in this tube. And true enough, when a train goes over, you can just hear a little bit of a rumble. But this, it doesn't disrupt the sound, in the building itself. You can still have a conversation. You can still hear things. And it sort of looks like it's crushing, he designed, let's go back. It looks like it's, crushing the building a little bit. He uses this element here on the facade, on the fascia, is just plywood, painted plywood. That's one of the things I thought would not hold up well in Chicago's winter. It has a little bit, but this is kind of famous. I was wearing my Mies t-shirt the other day of Mies's head, and the mouth opens when you walk up. The sensor opens the doors, and Mies's mouth opens up, and you walk into Mies's head. A lot of Miesians didn't like that. They thought he was making fun of Mies, but I suppose in a way he was doing it tongue-in-cheek as an homage to him. These are little symbols, and I forget what the name of that is, where you combine different symbols that have different, contrast of light and dark to create an image. When you step back from it, you can see Mises' face. When you get up close to it, you just see like somebody, waving a hand or sitting on a seat or something like that. Also, that orange glass. I'll show you another image here in a minute. That orange glass is funky. It's an insulated glass with an orange plastic inner layer that is. Whew. This is inside. This is the stainless steel of the tube from the L that is exposed, and then the drywall on the ceiling is left unpainted. They taped it and they did the joints or the anchors, and then they didn't paint it. And a lot of people were like, "When are they going to paint the ceiling?" Nope, supposed to be that way. And the contractor, I did talk to a lot with the contractor. He's like, "Yeah, this looks so simple. Like, oh man, this must have been so easy, so cheap to build because you don't have to, He's like, it was difficult because it wasn't going to be painted. You couldn't hide it. It had to be taped just right. It had to be beautifully done. And most guys who do the taping and caulking or whatever, spackling, they know it's just going to get, the wall's going to get painted. Their work doesn't matter too much. So that was tricky. The floor is a aluminum sheet, which is really funky and not easy to maintain. But let's go to the next image. Come on. Here's another view. There again, you can see the tube of the L kind of sticking down there. It's a cool space to be in. You have to have a little map so you don't get lost, I guess. But this is a hallway where that orange glass is, and like I say, it's really just a plastic insert in between the insulated glass. But it is a weird effect to walk in here. It's not a pleasant feeling to be in this orange space. So I don't know. I find this to be less than successful. Another one is the Seattle Library from 2004 in downtown Seattle, Washington. And here again, you can see forms and shapes that look like they're not meant to be. This cantilever up here looks like it isn't supported. You can see the triangles, just like we saw with some of the earlier structural technologies, going all the way back to the Hancock building by Fazlur Khan's structural engineering. Same thing, Sensible really is applying here to create this structure, but it allows some pretty funky shapes and forms and cantilevers that one would ordinarily not be able to do. Fly through some of these. Here's Melissa in one of those, showing off the scale of that. Here is the view of the main sort of lobby space of the library. It is sort of a cool space to be in. The fluorescent green escalators. I'm not so sure about that. Here's a cool view of the lobby atrium space. And there's the fluorescent green escalators that glow. Some of it's pretty weird to me, but. Here's another project. This is in Beijing from 2009, a pretty famous building, Central Chinese Television Tower, and it's another one that looks like it isn't structural. There's a show now. I think it's on the Smithsonian Channel. I don't know if you all get that on your cable and stuff, or most of you probably stream anyway. But there's a show that's like, how did they build that? I think that's the name of it. And they take buildings like this and they say, how do they do that? And it's actually pretty fun because they talk to engineers, they talk about the design process and the structural concepts that allow these buildings to function. And there's a few, some of them I'm familiar with. I've seen a few episodes, but sometimes they have a project. I'm like, that's cool. Where is that at? I want to learn more about it. So this is one of those that would probably show up on that show. I want to keep moving along here because we still got a little bit to go. Here is Fay Jones. Fay Jones is not a deconstructionist. He actually is a little more traditional. Born and raised in Arkansas, was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and eventually, although he got degrees from Arkansas and Rice University, he actually did apprentice at Taliesin with Frank Lloyd Wright for a time. Learned a lot about organic architecture from Wright, but he was talented enough that he was a threat to Wright, so the two of them probably didn't get along too well. And so he went off on his own, became very successful in the late 20th century. He did some of his best work in the 80s, some of his most famous work. And certainly his most famous is Thorn Crown Chapel in Eureka Springs from 1980. This put him on the map. This was really made a lot of media at the time, was still super famous in the late 80s when I was in architecture school. And, you know, he's breaking down the building into its basic forms. He's not applying ornament to it so much, but he's creating a very decorative element. It's very united with nature. It feels like it belongs in the forests and saw. It was really well known. His work was really well known as a very organic, architecture that is rooted in its site, in its environment. And I just want to, at least give you a few examples or show you some images of not just Thorn Crown, but there's one other one I want to show you. Here's a nice nighttime view of it all lit up. And here's his Gothic revival approach to it, with the pointed arches and vaulting that you would expect to see in a Gothic cathedral. He's not mimicking that, other than the pointed arch, which is a fundamental structural system, so it's okay to use that, but it kind of gives you that feeling of a Gothic church. But when you go inside, look how it looks. It's like you're in a forest of trees. I haven't been in either of these, but I've been in some Fay Jones chapels, and they are really exquisite, and they're beautifully detailed. I think I have an example here of his detailing. Here you can see a nice close-up view of some of the detail work of his structure. Speaking of structure, Calatrava, Santiago Calatrava is Spanish. He's actually from Catalonia. And he started out as a structural engineer. And even in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was in school, he was known for his bridges and engineering, not really as an architect, but he began to transition more into architecture and has become pretty famous now, for his buildings as much for his structures. But his buildings tend to be very expressionist structural systems. And I'll show you a few examples. This is one in Lisbon, the Gare de l'Orient, from 1998. And it's a train station. It's elevated, so the tracks are up here on top. He uses a lot of concrete to create the structure of the station, but then he uses this steel and glass to create a canopy, and it's like a forest of trees. And it's almost literally that's what he's trying to do. Here's a nice view as you walk up to the station, and you can see, these look like trees and the branches coming out, and it creates a canopy instead of canopy of leaves over it. It's a canopy of steel and glass that protects, from the weather when you're, standing on the train platform here. So here's a view from the train platform. It's a really cool station. I've been here, and I really like it. I love Calatrava's work. He's one of my favorite architects, to be quite honest. Some of you may have seen this. If you haven't, take a road trip to Milwaukee. This is the Art Museum edition from 2001, and it is really cool, and it's dynamic. These wings that come out here actually will fold in or they'll fold out. If it's really sunny, they will actually fold down and they will provide sunscreening for the glass, glazed exterior here, but they'll also spread out like a bird. It's just stunning. And then there's this bridge that goes across a highway, and you can see this is typical Calatrava, this angled pier that then uses the cable tie system that goes all the way back to the Brooklyn Bridge that we talked about earlier in the semester. So here's a close-up view of these wings that fold out or in, depending on the day. And if you get a chance to see them fold them in or out, that's pretty cool. They don't go very fast, so it's not like, boom, wow, that was cool. But you can take a video as it's doing it and then speed it up. Here's a straight-on view with the wings folded out, and here it is with the wings folded in. So that's like a before and after. Boom, boom. And if it gets windy, they have to fold them in too, because they don't want them flapping in the breeze. So here's the interior of that space with the wings folded in a little bit, so you can see how it shades it. Still a lot of light in here. It's a wonderful reception area. They'll do weddings and gatherings and stuff like that in here as well. But it's a really cool space, and this helped put Milwaukee on the map. Most people didn't know anything about the Milwaukee Art Museum, but now they want to come and they want to see this. This is another example of the Bilbao effect being used here. Just a cool photo I took. And the last thing I want to show you is this whole complex in Valencia, the City of Arts and Sciences, built over the span of, really almost over a decade. And I think they're still working on it. When I was there, they were still building some things. If this is like, if you wanted to do a, futuristic movie, or something set on Mars, with Martians or something like that, you could use this as your setting. It is really funky, and all of these buildings are by Calatrava. There are different types of museums. There's art museums, there's aquariums. It's like putting the Shed Aquarium, the Field Museum, and the Art Institute all together, and the Museum of Science and Industry in one big park, all designed in these funky designs by one architect, Calatrava. I'm just going to show you a few examples of it. Some of these, this is one of the older buildings here. You can see, this is really decorative, right? This is almost ornamental, but you can see elements of even Frank Gehry here with the folded plates and sheets and stuff. Here's one of the bridges. This is a bridge. So he's really known for these bridges, but has become quite famous for his architecture now. This was cool. This exterior is clad in these little purple tiles. Makes it look like a purple dinosaur or something, I think. There's another view of that. All right, just a few more examples. This is unfortunately, he was going to design what would have been the tallest building in America, the Spire, in 2008. But 2008 was when the economy crashed. And so they actually had dug a hole in the ground, and then the economy crashed, and it sat a big hole in the ground for a long time, and now the project's been abandoned. I think this would have been pretty cool. They called it the Spire because it was like this big corkscrew, and then it had this huge spire on top of that would have been technically the tallest building in America at the time. Pretty cool. I wish I'd seen it. There's plans for something else to be built on this site. It's right at the mouth of the Chicago River at Lakeshore Drive, so it's a very prominent site. So something will get built there one day. And the last one I want to show you is the transit hub at the World Trade Center. This is a post 9/11 construction. The transit hub, and train station was destroyed when the towers collapsed, and so he was hired to build a new one. And of course, here this is my photo when I visited the site a couple of years ago of the memorial. Pretty powerful place. And I tell you a real quick story, is that it was a really cloudy, dreary day in New York, and my wife and I are walking around. We get to the site here, we're going around. It's very emotional, and then all of a sudden, there's a break in the clouds, and the sun swoops across here, and it lights up the memorial. It lights up the bright white wings of the Calatrava Transit Hub. And then a moment, I took a whole bunch of photos real quick, and then it was gone. It only lasted, 10, 20 seconds or something like that. And that was it. Then it was back to gray, crappy day. And my wife was somewhere, she was like around the corner or something like that. And when I met up with her, I'm like, did you see that? She's like, wow, that was cool. She saw the same thing. That's the power of light. This is an even better photo, I think. You can see how gray it is all around it. Even the walls, the granite walls of the memorial, and then this bright white, reflecting in the sun. It was just a really cool effect, and very powerful because this is such a powerful emotional site here. Just a few more details of that. Very similar in a way. These are not dynamic, these don't move, but these ribs that stick out are very much like the Milwaukee Art Museum. And then the interior is pretty cool as well. Really neat space in here. Just a few photos of that. Almost done, and then we'll wrap up here for the day. So the last architects I want to talk about are Todd Williams and Billy Sen. This partnership, they've been really successful. They're a husband and wife, so personal partnership, professional partnership. Williams studied at Cranbrook and at Princeton. Sen studied at Yale and UCLA, so pretty good pedigree of their education. And they've really become famous in the 21st century, especially with their museum designs. This is one of their first ones from 2001, the American Folk Art Museum. This doesn't exist anymore. This is 20 years old and it doesn't exist anymore because it was right next to MoMA, and MoMA wanted to expand, and so they bought the site, and the Folk Art Museum went out of, they went defunct or something, and so MoMA bought it, and there was a big fight over this. People wanted this saved, and MoMA said, we can't. It didn't work for their needs, and so this got destroyed, not even 20 years old. So it was kind of weird and sad for that, but this kind of helped put them on the map. But here's one, that helped launch a number of careers. This is the Barnes Foundation Museum in Philadelphia from 2012, and you can see there's a mix of things that we've talked about here. They use a stone base, but with this cantilevered glazed element on top of that sticks out like the wing coming out here. And so I almost see a little bit of influence of Richard Meier here, of Calatrava, and it doesn't have the folded planes and forms of Calatrava and of Gehry or OMA, but it's still, it's taking those ideas and creating and using them in their own unique way. There's a nice sort of dusk view with it lit up. The entrance here using, reflecting pool of water, and you walk across that, almost a little bit like Tadao Ando here. I mean, it seems like they've got influences from a lot of different elements, and I like closing with them because of that. So here's the interior lobby space, a lot of exposed travertine stone, as well as a wood floor, introducing something a little warmer wood. Then here in Chicago is the Logan Center for the Arts down at the University of Chicago. This is right on the Midway Plaisance, and you can see it has these folded saw-cut roof forms. That's very industrial, actually. You used to see these in factories a lot. And then it has this tower that stands up that gives you some great vistas of the city. Here's another view of that with the tower. But the tower is broken up. It isn't just a big rectangle, so you see a little bit. It's not deconstructivist completely, right? But there's some of that influence in there. Here's an interior view of that. And then they're famous, or will be probably even more famous because of this guy right here. President Obama in 2017 hired them to design his presidential center, also in the south side of Chicago in Jackson Park. I think the lawsuits are just about done, so they'll probably be starting construction very, very soon. But here is the design. It's similar to the Logan Center in a way. It has this low-rise element, and then it has this tower element that is kind of a unique geometry that should provide a pretty cool vista of Jackson Park and the lakefront. There you can see the Museum of Science and Industry. I like ending with this too because it ties us back to Chicago, which has been a theme of this semester, and it ties us back to like the Columbian Exposition, which was held on this site, right? So, there's a lot going on here. I know it's been controversial, but for its location in Jackson Park, but I think it's going to be, personally, I think it's going to be a really cool fit and a really big draw to a neighborhood that needs it. It's definitely a neighborhood that could use people coming to visit and hopefully spending some time there, getting food or whatever, and visiting here. So it should be pretty cool when it's done. All right, so that is it.